Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron has publicly recognised the part his country played in the Rwandan genocide in 1994, in which 800,000 people, most of them Tutsis, were brutally murdered. In a speech given during a visit to the Rwandan capital Kigali, Monsieur Macron stopped short of a formal apology, but he did acknowledge his government's backing of the ruling Hutu regime, which carried out most of the killings. Well, joining me in the studio is Nabila Ramdani, French-Algerian journalist and broadcaster who specialises in French politics. Welcome back, Nabila. Great to have you in the studio.
Good morning, Emma.
It's a good feeling to have you here to talk about yesterday's speech by Emmanuel Macron. What exactly did he say? I mean, there was a notice that he didn't actually say sorry, but he did accept an awful lot of responsibility on behalf of France.
Yes, indeed. And his visit to Rwanda is of particular significance because it's the first by a French president to the Central African country in 11 years. And it was meant to extend efforts to recognise France's role in the 1994 genocide there. And even though President Macron publicly acknowledged France's overwhelming responsibility, as he put it, in the genocide, he also sought forgiveness for France's role in it. But as you said, he stopped short of apologising for it. But he did recognise that France was then, as he said, standing by the side of a genocidal regime. But he added that his country was not, in fact, complicit in the genocide because the killers were not French. And generally, the Macron speech was well received by the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, because it's the strongest public admission of responsibility from a French leader to date. And Kagame said that it was a major step in the relationship between the two countries, but he qualified his comments by saying that his country's relationship with France will never be entirely normal nonetheless.
Why is that?
Well, because you remember that in 1994, 800,000, mainly ethnic Tutsis, were killed by Hutu militias supported by the Rwandan government, and France has been repeatedly accused of failing to prevent the genocide and indeed of supporting the Hutu regime even after the massacres had started.
Now, some people are suggesting that Emmanuel Macron is trying to take a slightly less clumsy approach towards Rwanda and indeed in Africa in general than previous French leaders. The difficulty is that French leaders have until now been white male people, and it smacks of colonialism. And not just that, Emmanuel Macron has got form when it comes to saying some pretty outrageous things in the past, admittedly, but he has said them.
Indeed, and I think Macron's visit to Rwanda has to be put in the context of France's general policy towards the African continent. French leaders like Emmanuel Macron have a notoriously clumsy relationship with Africa for very obvious historical reasons. Many of the countries that they visit are former colonies, which by definition leads to a strained relationship. And French leaders are always white males, as you said. They are inevitably involved in a game of power politics aimed at exploiting the African continent while also showing benevolence to it. And Emmanuel Macron doesn't get this balance right. And I well remember him talking about Africa a few years ago, describing 7 or 8 children per woman, as if having large amounts of children was all African women really do. And so these tropes about a place that was once called the Dark Continent are very popular with Macron, who also spoke about civilizational problems caused by an escalating birth rate. And more recently, Macron said that there would be no apology for France's brutal colonialism in Algeria, which is the largest country in Africa by landmass. And this was despite him stating in 2017, during a visit to Algiers, that there would be an apology for war crimes and indeed crimes against humanity. So there's no doubt that Macron is always trying to please as many people as he can, even if many of his promises are never fulfilled.
And he's trying to please the domestic electorate as well back at home. Moving further and further towards the right as we have a presidential election coming up, his main rival being Marine Le Pen from the former National Front. And earlier on this year, we've spoken on Monocle 24 about this controversial bill which banned hate speech and which immediately put Emmanuel Macron at odds personally with many Muslim residents in France, citizens of France, and against many African nations.
Indeed, I think Africa is going to be very relevant indeed in the context of next year's presidential elections, especially as Macron attempts to counter the far right. But I think in very simple terms, Macron likes to try and attract votes from the African diaspora in France. And one of the reasons for his visit to Algeria in 2017 was to impress Algerian voters in France, for example. And clamping down on immigration from Africa is certainly a way of impressing far-right voters. Sarkozy infamously used to travel to Libya when he was interior minister to discuss immigration control in the run-up to his election as president of France. And I think Macron will certainly be wanting to look strong on immigration as he aims to win a second term next year.
One thing that Emmanuel Macron is doing is not necessarily just staying in French-speaking areas of Africa. He's going to South Africa. And is this going to change the perception of Emmanuel Macron in among several countries, given the fact that his focus isn't purely on former colonies?
Well, he's starting a 2-day visit in South Africa today, and the aim of this trip is at normalising relationships between France and indeed South Africa, but also more generally boosting cooperation in a number of sectors, including the economy and health, especially in the context of the global fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is no doubt that the legacy of what is called the France-Afrique is still very present. I mean, Macron's latest hugely ambitious pledge is to clear Sudan's debt to the International Monetary Fund, and he says that France will provide Sudan with a $1.5 billion bridging loan to facilitate the clearance and eventually help the entire $5 billion that the IMF is owed by Sudan. But it has to be said that debt cancellation is clearly an admirable way of assisting developing countries. But as always, there are conditions attached, and it's the same kind of policies that Macron is trying to see implemented across Africa. For example, he believes the withdrawal of militias from Libya is necessary for the security of the region and for France itself, of course. So I think it's fair to say that self-interest is really the driving force of French foreign policy, just as it has always been, and this is especially so in Africa.
Where is the self-interest in his threat of sanctions against Mali? I mean, Mali is in the middle of it's had 2 military coups in as many months, hasn't it? And France is absolutely embroiled, militarily at least, in issues in the Sahel. What purpose does threatening EU sanctions against them serve?
Well, there's no indication, even though Macron is now threatening EU sanctions against Mali, there's no indication that he's currently considering a re-intervention. Military interventions are always a very contentious issue for any country, and opinion polls regularly showed significant opposition from the French public to the French operations in Mali, which started in 2014. And as far as France is concerned, I think the worst aspect of the intervention was, of course, the loss of French soldiers. And the French presence was not welcomed by all Malians or Africans in general, especially after the killings of civilians in airstrikes. And France always pledged to reconsider its military strategy in the Sahel region and indeed to reduce military deployment as part of Operation Barkhane after significant military successes. But there's still a large amount of French troops in Africa.
Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much for joining us once again in the studio.